Maxine Waters had just called Senator John Kennedy a backwoods embarrassment. The hearing room erupted in laughter. It was the kind of laughter you hear in a high school cafeteria when the popular kids corner the nerd. Sharp, performative, and cruel. Democrats on the committee exchanged knowing glances. This was exactly what they had come to see. The sharp-tongued congresswoman from California destroying the folksy senator from Louisiana on live television. The atmosphere within the Rayburn House office building hearing room was less a forum for oversight and more a meticulously constructed stage for political sacrifice. The architecture itself was a declaration of permanent power. Walls paneled in dense, dark mahogany, polished to a reflective sheen that distorted the faces of those who dared to sit at the witness table. Ceilings vaulted so high that they seemed to demand reverence. Designed to make any individual, no matter how powerful, feel intrinsically small. This Tuesday, the room was set for a public dismantling. Maxine Waters made her entrance at the precise, calculated minute of 9:03 a.m. Her arrival was not a simple matter of walking into a room. It was a choreographed event. Signaling status and preparation, she was preceded by a phalanx that rivaled the security detail of a foreign head of state. 3 senior policy aides. 2 communication staffers already linked to the social media command center. A legislative director carrying binders that cost more than a family car. And, crucially, a legal counsel whose presence alone communicated that the stakes were impossibly high. She swept past the rail in a vibrant, architecturally precise red Chanel suit, a shade so bold it refused to acknowledge subtlety or defeat. The sharp edges of her signature jewelry caught the unforgiving committee room lighting, scattering harsh, bright reflections across the polished surfaces. For 35 years, she had mastered the labyrinthine politics of this city, and she moved with the confident, dominant stride of royalty, arriving not for consultation, but for the necessary discipline of an unruly subject. She radiated an aura of untouchable, permanent authority. Across the vast, polished expanse of the witness table, the subject of her anticipated scorn awaited. John Kennedy, the senator from Louisiana, appeared jarringly out of place, as if he had mistakenly wandered into the theater of power straight from a rural coffee shop. His navy suit was rumpled, comfortable, and unpretentious. It looked lived in, bearing the faint, familiar creases that suggested an overnight journey or a lack of concern for high-end tailoring. In one hand, he carried a well-worn manila folder, its edges softened and dog-eared from constant use. In the other, a simple, paper cup of bodega coffee, the opposite of the artisanal, high-priced beverages consumed by the Washington elite. He leaned slightly, chatting casually with a junior staffer about the nuances of the latest college football polls, projecting an image of profound, unpressured normalcy to the DC-centric press and the political class. He looked every bit the caricature. A tourist who had stumbled into the wrong room. An amateur about to be devoured by a professional. Waters watched him from her seat with barely masked, intellectual contempt. She instantly recognized the archetype she was about to face, the, shucks, country lawyer. The folksy, deceptively benign mask. She knew his true pedigree, the high honors from Vanderbilt, the prestigious editorship of the Virginia Law Review, the fellowship and first-class honors achieved at Oxford University. She concluded it was all a deliberate, calculated performance, a cheap trick to make himself appear harmless, relatable, and therefore, politically unassailable. It is all an act, she affirmed to herself, settling into her chair, ready to expose the charade. She had no idea how precisely right she was about the existence of the performance, and how fatally wrong she was about the intent and the consequence. The formal pretext for the gathering was a joint session on financial regulation oversight. A dry subject providing the perfect camouflage for political confrontation. Waters, the powerful former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, was the star witness, invited to offer her expert testimony. Kennedy, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, was merely afforded the right to question her. She saw the opportunity clearly. A chance to go viral. A moment to re-cement her status as the undisputed, sharp-tongued queen of the Democratic Party, capable of destroying any foe with a well-aimed verbal volley. He, in contrast, saw an ambush, a necessary moment to dismantle a facade with the cold, hard logic of public record. When the chairman finally recognized Congresswoman Waters for her opening statement, she did not bother with the technical notes or the formal requirements of the hearing. She looked directly at Kennedy, the target of the political missile. She began her assault, her voice dropping into that specific, honed patrician condescension she had perfected over decades. She spoke of his performances, his little one-liners, and his folksy sayings. The true problem, she suggested, was not his policy, but his persona. Maybe if the senator spoke proper English instead of playing a character, she declared with theatrical effect, the American people might take him seriously. The scattered laughter from the Democratic side was the first sound of affirmation. She pressed the attack, warming to the political destruction. You sit there in your committee hearings making jokes while real Americans suffer. She continued, her voice rising with practiced, theatrical indignation. You support tax cuts for billionaires while children in your own state go hungry. She framed him not as a public servant, but as a deceitful entertainer. You're a performer, a carnival barker in a blue suit. You're an embarrassment to the United States Senate. She then delivered the devastating, pre-planned kill shot line that her staff had spent the morning refining. Frankly, Senator, I'm surprised you can find your way to this chamber without a GPS and a seeing eye dog. The room erupted. Applause, laughter, even a few cheers signaled the political hit had landed perfectly. Waters's chief of staff was already typing furiously, preparing to post the clip of the immediate, absolute victory. She's destroying him, the internal staff texts confirmed. Kennedy remained motionless throughout the entire, withering attack. He did not frown, did not flush with anger, did not even blink. He simply watched her, his expression placid, like a man observing a necessary, localized storm blowing itself out. He had interrogated individuals far more formidable than a grandstanding politician. When she concluded, basking in the adoration of her staff and the scattered applause, Kennedy reached for his paper cup. He took a slow, deliberate sip, placing the cup back down with careful finality. The sound of the cup touching the mahogany was disproportionately loud in the sudden, expectant silence. The silence stretched for 3 long, uncomfortable seconds. Are you finished, Congresswoman? His voice was mild, carrying the deceptive, quiet softness of the Deep South, a tone that suggested utter lack of aggression. Her reply was a curt, single-sentence dismissal, delivered with her chin held high. I said what I said. Good. Kennedy's voice hardened instantly, the accent remaining, but the tone shifting from country lawyer to constitutional scholar. The mask of the, shucks, rube slipped just enough to reveal the cold, calculating intelligence underneath. He pulled the manila folder toward him, his hand resting on it, heavy, still, and absolute. Because now it's my turn. You called me an embarrassment. You questioned my intelligence. You suggested I'm just a simple country lawyer playing a role. He leaned forward, minimizing the vast expanse of the witness table. So, let me ask you a simple question, Congresswoman, a question even a backwoods embarrassment like me can understand. He paused, the anticipation in the room becoming a palpable, physical entity. The question that followed was not a continuation of her political theater, but a sudden, violent pivot into a realm of documented forensic reality. It hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, instantly vaporizing the air of victory and replacing it with dread. Who is Karen Waters? The simple query, who is Karen Waters, had the immediate, devastating effect of shattering the carefully constructed wall between the Congresswoman's public fury and her private finances. It was a calculated risk of an interrogation, bypassing policy and principle to strike at the exposed nerve of self-enrichment. Waters's initial shock quickly morphed into a visible, Hostile defiance. The sharp red suit seemed to vibrate with suppressed fury, yet she was forced to acknowledge the relevance. Karen Waters was her daughter. She confirmed sharply, the acknowledgement delivered with a tone that dared Kennedy to proceed further. He accepted the challenge not with words, but with the quiet, authoritative act of documentation. Kennedy opened the worn, unassuming manila folder, the gentle SSSHHH of the paper turning, captured by the sensitive studio microphones, served as a chilling, inescapable countdown to the financial exposure. He kept his gaze fixed on the highlighted spreadsheet, maintaining the objective detachment of a forensic accountant detailing cold figures. According to the meticulously organized records filed with the Federal Election Commission, FEC, he stated with flat, surgical precision, the Congresswoman's principal campaign vehicle, Citizens for Waters, had directed an astonishing $1.2 million to her daughter since 2003. $1.2 million. He allowed the raw, devastating sum to settle over the chamber, heavy with the implied cost of political influence. Waters's legal counsel, ever vigilant, attempted to whisper urgent advice. Sensing the immediate jeopardy, the Congresswoman, however, rejected the counsel with a sharp, dismissive wave of the wrist, prioritizing the political defense of her family over any legal tactic. The arrangement, she asserted, was entirely legal and standard. Her daughter ran the campaign's slate mailer operation, a commonplace, FEC-approved practice in California since 2004. It was, she insisted, simply a matter of legitimate, professional service. Kennedy did not dispute the legality. He merely agreed, his voice a pleasant, disarming drawl that intensified the underlying danger. "Oh, I know it's legal, Congresswoman. Lots of things are legal. That doesn't make them right." The soft agreement was a brutal dismissal of her defense. He then presented the visual evidence, a sample of the slate mailer itself. It was a complex, dense menu of political endorsements, immediately confirming the pay-to-play nature of the funding. He proceeded to outline the transaction in simple, brutal terms for the public watching at home. High-profile California Democrats, including major figures like Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom, injecting further high-stakes political context, paid the Congresswoman's campaign for her essential endorsement. Her campaign, in turn, funneled significant portions of these endorsement funds directly into the family's accounts. Specifically her daughter's accounts. The Congresswoman's political influence, he summarized, had been successfully monetized into a thriving, self-sustaining family enterprise, with her daughter as the designated financial conduit. Waters bristled, defensively snapping that her daughter manages the entire operation, a complex logistical enterprise involving printing, distribution, and mailing coordination across her vast constituency. But what does she actually do for $1.2 million? Kennedy interrupted with persistent, gentle inquiry, repeating the central, uncomfortable question that demanded a defense based on objective, professional merit, not familial relation. He pulled out another document, a simple classified advertisement, a job listing for a professional campaign mail coordinator in Los Angeles County. This, he declared, established the true, objective, external value of the work described. The market rate for professionally managing a campaign's mailers, he informed the room, was approximately $38 to $42 annually. He set the salary printout deliberately next to the official FEC report, creating a jarring visual and ethical indictment. The Congresswoman's daughter had averaged nearly $60 a year for 2 decades for the very same function, often receiving payments far in excess of even that bloated rate. The sheer absurdity of the expense caused a visible reaction. A young, visibly disheartened Democratic staffer in the gallery looked up from her laptop, the simple, uncomfortable math of her own meager salary and 80-hour workweeks failing to align with the Congresswoman's lucrative family arrangement. The discrepancy deepened, moving from the merely scandalous to the financially indefensible. Kennedy flipped to a recent campaign filing, highlighting a staggering spike in the payments to Karen Waters. In one single year, she had received an astonishing $192. This, Kennedy pointed out, was not a salary based on professional rates, it was a pure, unmitigated windfall. The Congresswoman's daughter, he emphasized, had made more money from the campaign in one single year than most of the Congresswoman's actual constituents earned in half a decade, simply for coordinating campaign mailers. The implication was clear. The people's money was funding her daughter's lifestyle. Waters' defense, completely stripped of its earlier, authoritative velvet tone, was reduced to a defensive, repeated insistence that her daughter was an expert in her field and had been with my campaign for decades. Kennedy, relentless in his pursuit of the pattern, expanded the scope of the inquiry beyond Karen Waters, indicating the deeper, systemic pattern of familial self-dealing. He cited a detailed Los Angeles Times report from 2004, detailing how other members of her immediate family, including her husband and son, had received over $1 million in total payments from her campaigns or business associates in the preceding 8 years alone. He then read the Congresswoman's own words, her past, published defense to the media, directly from the yellowed clipping. They do their business and I do mine. We are not bad people. He set the clipping down, the self-serving, compartmentalized nature of the statement hanging heavy and self-incriminating in the room. You're right, Congresswoman, Kennedy said, the quiet mildness utterly devastating. You're not bad people, you're just people who figured out how to turn campaign donations, the $20 from a school teacher, the $50 from a retired auto worker, into a guaranteed family paycheck, regardless of the market rate for the work. The room remained utterly silent. The Congresswoman's communications director held the pre-written victory tweet, utterly paralyzed by the exposure. Kennedy, having established the pattern of financial self-dealing, made his final position on the matter clear. He was not prosecuting a criminal act. As the slate mailer mechanism was technically legal, he was simply exposing a political betrayal. Did the working families who donated believe their money was funding the defense of their political champion? Or the guaranteed financial security of the Congresswoman's daughter? Waters gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white. The initial smile of arrogance was long gone, replaced by a deep-seated, visible apprehension. The first folder was closed. The financial integrity of the Waters family shattered into a dozen public records. Kennedy, having successfully completed the initial phase of the demolition, reached for the second folder. The tab clearly labeled, One United Bank. The transition from the family payroll to the high-stakes world of banking bailouts was seamless and chillingly deliberate. As Kennedy reached for the second folder, the tab clearly labeled One United Bank. A palpable fear replaced the Congresswoman's earlier anger. This file was the phantom limb of her career, a scandal buried by time and political maneuvering, now resurrected under the harsh glare of the committee lights. Her knuckles went white against the mahogany, signaling instant recognition of the file's lethal, career-ending potential. Kennedy began with the measured precision of a historian establishing a foundational crisis. September 2008. The financial world was in freefall. Lehman Brothers was dust. The global economy was collapsing. The U.S. Treasury, scrambling for triage, was deciding which institutions would live and which would die. He pointed to a single, critical entry in a phone log. September 9, 2008. The Congresswoman had personally placed a call to then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. She vaguely recalled the communication, quickly framing it as generalized, necessary advocacy for minority-owned institutions that were being systematically overlooked by the major regulators. Kennedy pressed past the deflection, demanding specifics. The result of that call was a requested meeting for those minority-owned banks. The meeting took place on September 17. In attendance, senior Treasury officials, Federal Reserve officials, and executives from one specific institution, One United Bank. He then delivered the fatal linkage. his voice dropping to a low, relentless tone. Who, he asked, was on One United's board of directors in September 2008? Silence. The Congresswoman's jaw was clenched tight. Your husband, Congresswoman, Kennedy stated flatly, Sidney Williams. She conceded her husband's board membership, yet quickly attempted to invoke the legal shield of separation, claiming her husband's investments were distinct from her congressional duties. Kennedy refuted the defense with documented evidence. He held up her 2008 financial disclosure form, the relevant lines highlighted in a harsh, neon yellow. The document confirmed her husband held stock in One United Bank valued between $250 and $500, a substantial investment of approximately $350, give or take. The separation she claimed was entirely fictitious. He explained, when she placed the personal, urgent call to the highest levels of the Treasury, One United was known to be in dire financial straits, effectively insolvent due to millions lost in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac stock. The bank was desperate for an allocation of TARP money, taxpayer-funded bailout capital. And she, a ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, had personally arranged the life-saving meeting for the specific institution where her husband had hundreds of thousands of dollars invested. The self-interest was undeniable. The Congresswoman rose slightly in her seat, shouting her defense, that she was helping all minority banks. Then why? Kennedy countered, his voice rising with focused, cold fury. Did One United's CEO specifically request the meeting through you? Why did you personally call Secretary Paulson if this was about all minority banks? Why were you the one intervening for this specific bank where your family had $350,000 invested? The consequence was the absolute summation of the exchange. On December 19, 2008, One United Bank received $12 million in TARP funds, taxpayer bailout money. Kennedy looked at her, his expression entirely devoid of personal anger, focusing only on the verifiable fact. Did that help your husband's stock value? Congresswoman? Waters stood up completely, attempting to escape the line of questioning and stop the deposition. I am not going to sit here and be accused. Sit down, Congresswoman, Kennedy commanded. It was not a plea or a request, but an absolute command that cut through the noise, demanding respect for the truth in the chamber. You wanted to talk about integrity. You do not get to walk away when I ask about yours. She sank back into the chair, visibly trembling with anger and trapped frustration. Kennedy spread the Ethics Committee documents before her. He cited the 3.5-year investigation and the conclusion reached by the Office of Congressional Ethics. She had arranged the Treasury meeting specifically to benefit One United and had failed to disclose her husband's interest, using her official position to aid a bank where her family had hundreds of thousands of dollars invested. The committee eventually cleared her. She snapped triumphantly, grasping for the technical acquittal. On a technicality, Kennedy shot back, cutting off her celebration. The committee concluded she thought she was helping all minority banks, even though she arranged the specific meeting for One United. Ultimately, they had blamed the staffer, her own grandson, Mikhail Moore, giving him a letter of reproval instead. They had sacrificed the staffer to save the member. The distilled reality of the transaction was presented. Her husband had $350 in a failing bank. She intervened personally. The bank received $12 million in taxpayer money. Her husband's investment was protected. Kennedy delivered the essential hypothetical, the ultimate test of integrity. If a Republican member of Congress, let's say a Tea Party conservative, had arranged a meeting for a bank where his wife had $350 invested, and that bank got $12 million in bailout money, would you call that corruption? Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, grasping for a distinction that did not exist in fact. That's different. How? Kennedy pressed, his voice deadly quiet, demanding a factual, specific defense. Explain to me how it's different. Tell me the difference between you helping a bank where your husband is a board member versus a Republican doing the exact same thing. The studio was absolutely silent. She had no answer that the facts would support. The context is that you used your position to help your family financially. Kennedy concluded. That's called self-dealing, Congresswoman. He closed the second folder with a definitive snap. You said you were helping minority banks. But from where I'm sitting, it looks like the only minority that got helped was your family. He reached for the third folder. The tab plainly visible to the cameras. Estate holdings. The shift in focus was immediate and profound, moving abruptly from the high-stakes, opaque world of financial bailouts to the stark, irrefutable reality of Los Angeles property records. Waters's anxiety intensified, recognizing a trap set not by federal agencies, but by simple geography. Kennedy began with the mild, disarming tone of a small-town census taker. Where do you live, Congresswoman? She blinked, momentarily confused by the simplicity of the unexpected question. Excuse me? Your residence, Kennedy clarified, his voice flat and unyielding. Your home address. Where do you lay your head at night? She quickly deflected, stating she lived in Los Angeles. When pressed for the specific location, she hesitated, citing the lawyer's subtle visual cue. Security concerns necessitated vagueness for a public figure. It's public record, Congresswoman, Kennedy interrupted flatly, dismissing the pretense of security. Property records are available to anyone with an internet connection. He pulled out a printout, holding it up, the address highlighted in bold type for the room to see. You live in Hancock Park. He allowed the name to resonate, an exclusive, ultra-affluent neighborhood of historic, multi-million-dollar mansions, marked by tree-lined streets, meticulously manicured lawns, and the pervasive quiet of private security patrols. He confirmed the beauty and the safety of the residence, valued at approximately $6 million. There's just one problem, he stated, producing a map and tapping a single location. Hancock Park is in California's 37th Congressional District. He looked over his glasses, the shift in his gaze carrying the weight of the revelation. You represent the 43rd District. The words landed not as a political argument, but as an indictment of structural hypocrisy and profound abandonment. She did not live in the district she represented. She did not drive the same streets, breathe the same air, or hear the sirens that dictated the lives of her constituents. Waters attempted the standard political deflection. Redistricting changes boundaries constantly, and she had always maintained her connection. Kennedy was ready, but you didn't move, did you? He pressed. When the lines were redrawn, she made a choice. She stayed in the mansion, choosing the zip code with the private golf courses and historic estates over the zip code containing the food deserts and urban decay of her actual constituency. He pulled out a sheet of statistics about the district she refused to inhabit, the 43rd District. The area she had sworn to represent suffered from a 43% poverty rate, the highest in the city. Homelessness had violently increased by 264% since 2009. Violent crime and homicide rates were sharply elevated. 1 in 3 children lived below the poverty line. You've represented this district for 34 years, Congresswoman, Kennedy stated, his voice now carrying the cold, unforgiving weight of her tenure. In that time, your constituents got poorer, they got more homeless, they got less safe, and you got a $6 million mansion in a different zip code. He reached into his folder and produced a single, handwritten sheet of paper. He spoke softly, introducing the author, Darnell Washington, a 67-year-old constituent from South Los Angeles who had asked him to read his words aloud. Kennedy cleared his throat and read the letter, a simple, raw testament to neglect. Washington spoke of hearing gunshots every week, of sidewalks covered with homeless encampments, and of a congresswoman who lived in a mansion far away. The core accusation was delivered with painful clarity. She doesn't even hear the same sirens we do. She left us behind a long time ago. Across the room, the raw impact of the letter was immediate. A black woman in the gallery, a constituent from the 43rd District, openly wept, her 3 decades of loyalty to the Congresswoman shattered by the documented, undeniable truth. A neighboring Democratic congressman, unable to bear the exposure of this betrayal, quietly stood up, gathered his briefcase, and slipped out of the room, unwilling to be politically associated with the scene. Kennedy's voice dropped even lower, the tone more powerful than any volume, carrying the resonance of personal conviction. He contrasted her life with his own, living in the same house in Madisonville, Louisiana, for decades, same church, same neighbors, same zip code as the people he represented. He did not claim superiority, he claimed presence. He looked directly at Waters, delivering the sentence of moral judgment, his voice heavy with the weight of broken promises. You won't even share a zip code with yours. Waters was visibly slumped in her chair. The defiant posture of the morning entirely collapsed. She looked physically smaller, the red suit a symbol of a power now being suffocated by its own hypocrisy. Her aide attempted to offer her a glass of water, but she waved it away with a desperate, dismissive gesture. The cameras rolled, capturing the silent, total disintegration of her authority. Kennedy closed the third folder, the grim satisfaction of a necessary job completed hardening his eyes. The real estate was addressed, the integrity was gone. He reached for the fourth folder. The tab clearly read, Public Incitement. Congresswoman, Kennedy began, his voice taking on a low, grave cadence that was far more menacing than the shout of a prosecutor. You opened this hearing by questioning my intelligence. You called me an embarrassment. You suggested my words, my commentary, were dangerous and caused harm to working Americans. He pulled out a sheath of old newspaper clippings, transcripts, and court documents. So, let's look at who actually uses dangerous rhetoric in this country, and let the record speak. He began with the Los Angeles civil unrest of May 1992. An event of profound chaos that resulted in 63 fatalities, thousands of injuries, and the systemic destruction of minority-owned businesses that never reopened. He presented a clipping where the Congresswoman, referring to the deadly violence and looting, described the riots as a rebellion, stating that the destruction was somewhat understandable, if not acceptable. She had, he pointed out, used her platform to justify the destruction of the very city she represented, validating violence as a political tool. He moved quickly to June 2018. The Congresswoman had given a speech directly addressing the Trump administration's policies. She did not merely disagree, she issued a clear, public marching order to her supporters. He read her words slowly, deliberately, forcing the room to absorb the intent. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them that they are not welcome anymore anywhere. Kennedy summarized the effect. She had mandated confrontation, harassment, and intimidation of government officials in their private lives, while they were having dinner with their families or buying gasoline. You were calling for a mob. Kennedy corrected her in spoken defense that she was merely calling for peaceful protest. And you received precisely what you asked for. The third document was the definitive indictment. April 17, 2021, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd was underway. The jury sequestered, and the city a tinderbox of tension. The Congresswoman traveled to the city and stood before a crowd of protesters. Kennedy played the clip on the screen, her amplified voice booming through the silent studio. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business. Get more confrontational, Kennedy echoed, pausing the video just as her image filled the screen. This instruction was delivered while a jury was deliberating a major police brutality case, while the city was holding its collective breath against further violence. I was speaking about legislation, Waters shouted, desperately trying to reframe the statement into a benign policy discussion. Were you? Kennedy countered, pulling out a court transcript. He read the public criticism issued by Judge Peter Cahill, the presiding judge in the Chauvin trial. a man with no political agenda, whose concern was solely the integrity of the judicial process. The judge had publicly condemned her comments from the bench, stating that her actions were disrespectful to the rule of law. He read the judge's final, shocking statement. Congresswoman Waters may have given you something on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned. A collective, audible gasp went through the studio audience and the press corps. You nearly caused a mistrial, Congresswoman, Kennedy whispered, the lethal quietness of his voice magnifying the severity of the offense. You nearly allowed the biggest police brutality trial in decades to be thrown out. You nearly let a murderer walk free on a technicality because you couldn't resist the urge to grandstand for the cameras. He noted that while the motion for an immediate mistrial was denied, the judge had handed the defense a golden ticket for an appeal, stating her words were abhorrent. He held up House Resolution 327, introduced in the 117th Congress, titled, Expel Maxine Waters, Resolution for Incitement of Violence and Rioting Against the United States. Members of Congress, Kennedy noted, including some from your own party who quietly refused to defend you, believed your words were dangerous enough to warrant your expulsion. He looked at her, his voice utterly implacable. You called me dangerous, Congresswoman, but let's look at the record. I have never told supporters to form a mob. I have never described deadly riots as acceptable. I have never been criticized by a federal judge for threatening to taint a jury. You have done all of those things. He closed the fourth folder with a decisive movement. The distinction between their rhetoric was absolute, and her record was indefensible. Kennedy closed the folder on incitement, the sound echoing through the room and signaling the end of the documented accusations. The energy in the chamber shifted from the high tension of exposure to the heavy, expectant stillness of final judgment. Waters sat, trembling, the rage of the morning utterly replaced by the terror of a complete public dismantling. She had prepared for a political brawl. She had received a comprehensive deposition of her life's compromises. Kennedy removed his reading glasses, folding them deliberately and setting them down on the mahogany. The prosecutorial edge in his voice softened, replaced by a calm, almost serene, professorial tone. You called me a backwoods embarrassment. He began, addressing her earlier, arrogant insults. You mocked my accent. You suggested I'm just a simple country lawyer playing a role because I don't know any better. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking less like a senator and more like a professor about to deliver a lecture on humility and credentials. I graduated magna cum laude from Vanderbilt University. He began, ticking off the first finger. Phi Beta Kappa. That's the honor society for people who read books. Ma'am, in case you were wondering. He raised a second finger. I was executive editor of the Virginia Law Review. That's the top of the class at one of the finest legal institutions in this country. I was elected to the Order of the Coif. He raised a third finger. And then I earned first-class honors at Oxford University in England. Magdalen College. I studied under constitutional scholars whose books you've probably never read. And I wrote papers that are still cited today. Kennedy looked directly at her. The country bumpkin, mask slipping entirely to reveal the formidable, razor-sharp intellect beneath. By educational credentials alone, Congresswoman, I am one of the most qualified members of the United States Senate. I have forgotten more law than most people ever learn. The intellectual chasm she had attempted to create with her mockery was now a chasm she stood alone in. But I don't talk like an Oxford don, he continued, his Louisiana drawl thickening slightly, a deliberate act of reclaiming his identity. He explained his deliberate choice. His father, a small-town insurance salesman in Zachary, Louisiana, had taught him something more profound than any legal theory. Fancy words don't make you smart. Helping people makes you smart. Telling the truth makes you smart. Staying humble when you could brag, that makes you smart. He looked directly into the cameras. Speaking to the nation, I talk like the people I represent because they are my people. I'm not putting on an act. Congresswoman, I'm being who I was raised to be. And I am not ashamed of where I come from. He dismissed her conception of power and sophistication, the mansions, the condescension, the yelling. You seem to think that leadership means yelling the loudest. That ain't smart, ma'am. That's just loud. The moment of personal reflection ended as quickly as it began. The steel returned to his spine. Now, Kennedy said, his voice hardening, let me tell you about the difference between us. Not where we went to school, not how we talk, but what we've done. He opened the final section of his folder, which was not a new scandal, but a clinical summary of her 35 years in power. He looked at the chart showing economic decline in her district. We've talked about your daughter, the bank, the mansion, the riots, but let's talk about the job itself. You have been in Congress for 35 years. Congresswoman, a lifetime. He detailed her personal trajectory. She had climbed the ladder, gained ranking positions, became a chairwoman, and achieved immense fame and wealth. You got power, you got fame, you got rich. He pointed to the downward sloping line on the chart. But your district, your people, they got poorer. The poverty rate in your district remains stuck at over 20%. Homelessness has exploded under your watch. The schools are failing. He cited her most powerful role as chair of the House Financial Services Committee. You had the gavel. You had the power to rewrite the rules of the American economy. And what did you deliver? Did you pass a comprehensive housing bill to get your people off the streets? No. Did you pass banking reform that actually stopped the predatory lending you talk about? No. He shook his head. You spent your time on committee hearings designed for cable news. You spent your time reclaiming your time. You spent your time selling Impeach 45 t-shirts. It's not legislation, Congresswoman. It's theater. Kennedy stood up, a rare, powerful move in a committee hearing. Signaling the closing argument, he walked around the table, standing in the well of the room, bridging the gap between the Senate and the House. He contrasted his own record, fighting for flood victims, securing lower insurance rates, working across the aisle. I live in Madisonville, Louisiana, same house I've lived in for decades. I teach Sunday school. When there's a funeral in town, I go. He turned back to Waters, his voice heavy with finality. You called me an embarrassment to the Senate. But here's the difference between us, Congresswoman. He paused, letting the silence build to an unbearable tension. When I finish my term, I'll drive home to the same people I represent. Same streets, same neighbors, same church pew on Sunday morning. They'll wave at me in the grocery store. And I'll listen, because they're my people, and I owe them that. Kennedy's eyes never left hers. When you finish your term, you'll drive to a $6 million mansion in a neighborhood your constituents couldn't afford to visit, let alone live in. You'll be surrounded by security guards and staff members. He delivered the final, crushing blow. You asked, who's the embarrassment? Between the two of us, Congresswoman, only one of us is an embarrassment to their office. Only one of us got rich while their constituents got poor. Only one of us turned public service into a family business. And with all due respect, ma'am, it ain't the gentleman from Louisiana. He sat back down, straightened his tie, and simply stated, I yield back my time. The 4 seconds of silence that followed Kennedy's closing statement were an agonizing, profound eternity. In television terms, it was a catastrophic failure of sound. In political terms, it was the sound of a reputation flatlining. Waters remained frozen at the witness table, her knuckles white against the mahogany. She had survived decades of political warfare, impeachment efforts, and numerous scandals, yet she could not survive the factual weight of her own documented record. Systematically presented, Kennedy had not resorted to falsehoods. He had merely read her truth out loud. The chairman finally broke the unbearable silence, his voice carefully neutral. Congresswoman Waters, do you have any response? Waters reached for the microphone. Her hand visibly trembled, not a slight, unnoticeable shake. but a genuine tremor captured mercilessly by the high-definition cameras. Her voice cracked instantly. She cleared her throat and made one last, desperate attempt at defiance. I reject the characterization that. She stopped abruptly. She realized Kennedy had not characterized anything. He had simply cited FEC filings, property deeds, court transcripts, and her own published quotes. He had used nouns and verbs, not adjectives. She looked down at the papers before her, the prepared attack lines against Kennedy's accent. His state, his party, now seemed utterly absurd. She had brought a ceremonial dagger to a siege. I have nothing further, she whispered. Those 4 words were the complete, total surrender of the woman who had coined reclaiming my time as a political war cry. It would instantly become the most shared clip of the year, shorthand for absolute political destruction. Her aides rushed forward to form a protective human barrier, shielding her from the cameras as she gathered her shaking papers. Reporters shouted questions about the payments, the mansion, and the ethics committee. She didn't answer. She didn't look up. For the first time in anyone's memory, Maxine Waters left a congressional hearing without speaking to the press. No defiant soundbite, no finger-wagging promise to fight back, just silence. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind her. In the hearing room, John Kennedy calmly gathered his folders. He exchanged a brief, quiet word with a colleague and shook the chairman's hand. He offered only a single, polite comment to the reporters who swarmed him. I didn't say anything that wasn't public record. I just said it out loud. Sometimes that's all it takes. He walked out of the Rayburn building and drove back to his office. The internet, meanwhile, was exploding. The video hit 25 million views in 48 hours. Hashtag Mansion Maxine trended for 5 consecutive days. Kennedy's phrase, "You won't even share a zip code with yours," became an instant cultural touchstone for political hypocrisy across all parties. I have nothing further became the new, infinitely more damning. No comment. The damage was swift and structural. Within a week, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, announced a comprehensive audit of her campaign finances. The evidence laid out by Kennedy too specific to ignore. 3 progressive Democratic colleagues, citing the need for ethical reform, publicly endorsed the bill to ban family members from campaign payments, giving the legislation immediate, crucial momentum. 2 weeks later, buried in a late Friday evening news dump, her office announced the Congresswoman would not seek a leadership position on any committee in the next Congress. She intended to focus on her constituents in what may be her final term in office. The quiet admission of a final term was an astonishing reversal for the career politician. A formal declaration of her authority's end. The final blow came from Los Angeles. Darnell Washington, the 67-year-old constituent whose letter Kennedy had read aloud, appeared on local television, sitting on his porch in South Los Angeles. He spoke with raw emotion. "I voted for Congresswoman Waters for 30 years. I believed in her. But that senator from Louisiana, he told the truth. She lives in a mansion. We live with the tents. She got rich. We got forgotten. I'm done defending her. I'm done believing." 6 months later, Maxine Waters announced she would not seek re-election, citing a desire to spend time with her family. Internal polling had shown her approval rating in the 43rd district had collapsed, and she was in real danger of losing her primary. She chose a voluntary retirement over a public, humiliating defeat. The gentleman from Louisiana had accomplished what 34 years of elections could not. He had told the truth, and the truth had finally prevailed. Zachary, Louisiana. 6 weeks after the hearing, John Kennedy sat in his usual booth at Marie's diner. Marie, the owner, set down the coffee pot, shaking her head. "You really think it'll change anything up there, John?" Kennedy looked out the window at the quiet Main Street. "Maybe, maybe not. Politicians got short memories. But sometimes, Marie, you got to say what's true, even if it don't change nothing right away." He finished his coffee. "My daddy used to tell me sunlight is the best disinfectant. I just opened the curtains. He left enough cash on the table for a generous tip and walked out into the morning sun. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look for headlines. He thought about the fence he needed to fix before the deer ate his wife's tomatoes. He had exposed a fraud. He had defended a constituent. He had done his job. The truth doesn't need a public relations campaign. He had once told a friend. It doesn't need a lawyer. The truth just needs a little time. And someone willing to say it out loud.